Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable people become when someone asks a question that challenges the established narrative? There's a subtle tension that fills the room. Awkward glances exchange. Someone quickly changes the subject. This isn't accidental. Society has engineered itself to reward those who accept rather than question. Those who move quickly rather than pause. Those who repeat rather than reconsider. And there's a reason for this. A deeper, more unsettling reason than most realize. There exists a type of person who represents an invisible threat to the social order. Not because they're rebellious or disruptive in the traditional sense, but because of how they think, how they process reality, how they see through layers that others have been conditioned not to notice. And this capacity, this way of thinking, is what society has quietly learned to fear. Today, we're going to explore why certain thinkers make systems uncomfortable, how society subtly pushes them to the margins, and why this dynamic has existed throughout human history. Because understanding this pattern isn't just about validation. It's about recognizing one of the most powerful forms of control that exists in the modern world. The unspoken pressure to think within acceptable boundaries. These boundaries weren't created by accident. They were designed to maintain a specific order, and those who think beyond them reveal something that power structures would rather keep hidden. The people society quietly fears aren't those who rebel loudly. They aren't the ones breaking windows or shouting slogans. They're much more subtle, and in many ways, more threatening to the established order. They're the ones who pause when everyone else rushes to judgment. The ones who notice contradictions in narratives that others accept without question. The ones who ask why about things we've been taught to take for granted. You might know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. The person who sits in the meeting and asks the question nobody wants to address. The friend who points out the inconsistency in a popular belief. The colleague who wonders aloud about the ethical implications that everyone else conveniently ignores. What makes these thinkers distinct isn't just intelligence, it's awareness. A particular kind of awareness that sees through social scripts and cultural programming. They notice how people adopt opinions without examining them. How institutions maintain power through unchallenged assumptions. How comfort is often chosen over truth. And it's this awareness that creates a subtle discomfort in others. Because these thinkers don't just question ideas, their very existence questions the way most people have been taught to think. When someone in a group points out that the emperor has no clothes, they're not just challenging the emperor. They're challenging everyone who has pretended to see the clothes. And that creates a psychological threat that triggers defensive reactions. This explains why independent thinkers often face social penalties that seem strangely disproportionate to what they've actually done. They haven't broken any rules. They've simply questioned whether the rules make sense. The threat these thinkers pose goes beyond mere disagreement. Their way of processing reality undermines something much more fundamental: authority itself. Think about how authority maintains its position. Not primarily through force, but through controlling what questions are considered reasonable to ask. By establishing what conclusions are socially acceptable. By defining the boundaries of sensible thought. When someone thinks outside these boundaries, they threaten the entire foundation. Because true authority doesn't rest on having the right answers. It rests on controlling what questions are allowed. History shows us this pattern repeatedly. Socrates wasn't executed for giving wrong answers. He was executed for asking questions that undermined the authority of Athens' leaders. Galileo wasn't imprisoned for being incorrect. He was imprisoned because his observations questioned the church's monopoly on truth. Even today, this dynamic continues in more subtle forms. The person who questions economic systems isn't just debating policy. They're challenging power structures that benefit from those systems remaining unexamined. The employee who asks why certain decisions are made isn't just seeking information. They're challenging the hierarchical authority that prefers not to justify itself. This is why societies throughout history have marginalized philosophical thinkers. Not because their ideas were wrong, but because the very act of independent thinking represents a form of power that systems cannot control. And here's what's fascinating about human psychology. When beliefs are questioned at a fundamental level, people don't typically respond with reasoned arguments. They respond with defense mechanisms: dismissal, ridicule. anger, isolation of the questioner. These reactions aren't rational responses to the content of the questions. They're emotional responses to the threat those questions represent to a person's psychological security. Because for many people, questioning foundational assumptions feels like the ground disappearing beneath their feet. If you think differently, you've likely experienced the subtle and not so subtle ways society penalizes those who question too deeply. It begins with labels. Overthinking. Too serious. Impractical. Difficult. These aren't neutral descriptions. They're social tools used to pathologize independent thought, to frame depth as a problem rather than a strength. Then comes the exclusion. Not usually explicit rejection, but something more insidious. The meeting where your perspective isn't sought. The conversation that subtly shifts when you enter. The sense that your questions make people uncomfortable, though they'll never admit why. You feel the pressure to conform to conversational norms, to stick to acceptable topics, to not pursue a thought too deeply when it makes others uneasy, to laugh along with jokes that mask uncomfortable truths rather than examining them. And perhaps most painful is the isolation that comes from seeing what others refuse to acknowledge. The loneliness of noticing patterns that others are blind to, not because they can't see them, but because seeing them would require uncomfortable realignments in how they understand reality. This is the quiet burden carried by those who think differently. Not just being misunderstood, but being subtly pushed to question their own perceptions. To wonder if maybe they're the problem for noticing what others don't, for asking questions others won't. This form of gaslighting is particularly effective because it operates at a collective level. When an entire group or society acts as if certain observations are invalid, it creates profound doubt in the observer, even when their perceptions are accurate. If you've experienced this, remember, the fact that your thinking creates discomfort doesn't make it wrong. Often, it means you've touched on something that needs examination, something others have been conditioned to avoid. So, what exactly characterizes the psychological patterns of these independent thinkers that society finds so threatening? First, they have an unusual capacity to notice inconsistencies. Where others see isolated facts, they see patterns. They detect when words contradict actions, when stated values conflict with actual behaviors, when surface appearances mask deeper realities. Second, they process information differently. While many people organize facts according to established categories, independent thinkers constantly reorganize information based on connections they observe. They're less concerned with how things have traditionally been classified and more interested in how they actually relate. Third, they show remarkable resistance to emotional manipulation and group pressure. Not because they're unemotional, but because they're aware of how emotions can be weaponized to short-circuit critical thinking. They notice when fear, pride, or desire for belonging is being leveraged to promote certain conclusions. And finally, they develop an inner strength from standing in their truth even when it's unpopular. This isn't stubborn close-mindedness. It's the opposite, a willingness to revise their views based on evidence rather than social pressure. They're committed to accuracy over acceptance. These qualities make independent thinkers invaluable but uncomfortable additions to any group. They see the hidden assumptions, unexamined contradictions, and unspoken motivations that others miss. And in doing so, they challenge the comfortable illusions that often hold groups together. This explains why even progressive organizations that claim to value diversity often struggle to truly welcome cognitive diversity. It's easy to include people who look different but think the same. It's much harder to include those who genuinely think differently, who question the group's cherished assumptions. The irony is that what society fears is precisely what it needs most. Throughout history, the thinkers initially feared and rejected have often been the ones who moved humanity forward. They saw possibilities others couldn't imagine. They questioned harmful patterns others had normalized. They envisioned more just, more truthful ways of organizing society. Einstein, Curie, Tesla, Tubman, Truth, Socrates. In their times, each was viewed with suspicion for thinking beyond accepted boundaries. Today, we recognize their courage in standing firm when society pushed back against their insights. A society without independent thought becomes intellectually stagnant, morally complacent, and vulnerable to manipulation. When nobody questions the prevailing narrative, when nobody notices the contradictions between what we say and what we do, when nobody examines the hidden costs of our choices, we lose the capacity for genuine progress. This doesn't mean independent thinkers should reject society entirely. The challenge is finding the balance between belonging and authenticity, between connecting with others and maintaining your intellectual integrity. If you're still watching this video, chances are you've recognized something of yourself in this description. You know what it's like to see what others overlook, to question what others accept, to think in ways that sometimes create distance between you and those around you. I'd like to invite you to share your experience in the comments below. When was a time you noticed something others didn't want to acknowledge? How did you handle the tension between speaking your truth and maintaining connections? Type, "I see beneath the surface," and then share your story. Your experience might help another person feel less alone in how they process reality. Like this video, if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more content that explores the deeper patterns of human experience. It helps more people discover these ideas who might need them. Now, let's talk about reclaiming the power of independent thought without unnecessary isolation. First, recognize that your way of thinking is not a flaw to be corrected. It's a capacity to be developed. Society may subtly suggest that you should doubt your perceptions, question your sensitivity to contradictions, or reduce the depth of your analysis. Resist this form of collective gaslighting. Second, find others who value depth and authentic connection. They exist, though they may not be the most visible or vocal. Often they're quietly observing, just like you. When you encounter someone who isn't afraid of nuanced conversation, who welcomes questions that probe beneath the surface, nurture that connection. Third, learn to translate your insights in ways others can receive. This isn't about diluting your truth, but about finding bridges between your understanding and theirs. Independent thinkers sometimes struggle to communicate effectively because they see connections that aren't obvious to others. Practice articulating your perspective in ways that help others see what you see. And finally, use your awareness as a strength rather than experiencing it only as a burden. Your capacity to notice what others miss gives you valuable information about people, about systems, about potential futures others haven't considered. This awareness is a form of power when you learn to work with it rather than being overwhelmed by it. The quiet revolution of our time isn't happening in the streets. It's happening in the minds of those who refuse to think in prescribed ways, who insist on examining what they're told rather than simply believing it, who maintain their intellectual sovereignty in an age that increasingly outsources thinking to algorithms, experts, and ideologies. This is not about cynicism or rejection of community. It's about bringing greater consciousness to how we participate in our communities. It's about engagement based on clarity rather than conditioning. Here's the final paradox. Society fears what it desperately needs. The capacity for independent thought that systems find threatening is precisely what prevents those systems from becoming rigid, corrupt, or divorced from human well-being. Thinking differently isn't just rebellion. It's evolution. It's how humanity has always grown beyond its current limitations. Not through blind acceptance of what is, but through courageous exploration of what could be. So, if you're someone who thinks in ways that sometimes create discomfort, who sees layers others miss, who questions what others take for granted, know this: your mind isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a light in a world that often prefers the comfort of shadow to the demands of clarity. And though this way of being carries challenges, it also carries profound gifts. For yourself, for those who know you, and for a world that may not always appreciate the questions you raise, but whose future depends on people brave enough to raise them. The courage to think independently in a society that rewards conformity isn't just a personal choice. It's a form of service to truth, to possibility, to a more conscious future that can only emerge through minds willing to venture beyond the boundaries of the present. This is your gift. Use it wisely. Use it compassionately. But never apologize for seeing clearly in a world that often prefers the comfort of blur.